Hello, everybody. Welcome back to another episode of Middleism Apologetics and Eschatology. Today, want to welcome everybody back who's following along. Couple announcements, real quick, real first. I'm going to be doing something a little bit different today. I'm going to be going over Revelations 20 and explaining why am I a premillennialist. And recent little bit of discussion, a heated discussion. Because I just kind of find it kind of simply the issues that they brought up were just kind of blew my mind a little bit. But in talking with Revelations 20 and of course dealing with that whole subject about why I'm premillennial, I did put a chapter in my book, and you can find it on Amazon.com, The Cold Case Against Full Preterism, and where I deal with that. All of those issues, and also you can find up there, hey, look, my other one, Middle Eschatology, an answer to the preterist heresy. It is a expansion of my master's thesis on the Olivet discourse and the Revelation juxtaposition, how those two are different and not about the same time periods, and it gives an answer also for dispensationalism and some of the other forms that and kind of lays that out a little bit better. The other book here you might be interested in is the Debunking Predators. Now, I disagree with some of his points, obviously, but overall, it's not a bad book. And you can get that from David Hollett, Brock David Hollett, I should say. He's got his book out there. And the latest one that's come out from Roderick Edwards, who was a preterist for a long time, he simply has written a very simple, concise book about preterism. He's not going into theological details or anything, but he's just presenting the case of where it comes, what it's about, and I think he even talks about why he is not in it. And so far he's at he's almost at 5 stars. Meanwhile, I'm at 3 stars because Full Preterists got on with my book and did everything they could to destroy my rating system here by giving me low ones completely different, as deliberately as possible. But as far as this book, yeah, see the same thing. They did that. I get it from from them guys who give me negative ones, and then Bill Dullock accused me of plagiarism, and then very low 2 out of 5 stars from somebody else. I'm not quite sure who did that. A low 5 stars. Well, hey. I know everybody's not going to agree with everything, correct? But it's there. I outlined the case. Now, let's get into Revelations 20. The chapter starts off, and if we're going to be looking at it, the first question that comes to mind here in these first 4 verses is, it is a binding of Satan versus an imprisonment of Satan. And I'm going to kind of go over this real quick. And basically the doctrine is, of course, is that Jesus said, if a man wants to rob somebody's house, you got to first go in there, bind the strong man, and then you can take what he wants. You bind him. And then he told the disciples, whatever you bind on earth, I will bind in heaven, giving the disciples the authority to exercise authority over Satan. And that's basically what binding means, is that you're able to exercise authority as a Christian over Satan and demonic forces. And that's part of the spiritual warfare that goes on, Peter and others talk about. I'm not going to get into all that, of course, obviously here. But the idea is that it is not ever taught that Satan himself is bound on a permanent basis. It never expresses that. It never claims that. In fact, Peter, I believe, is the one who says that he is the prince and the power of the air. That he's free to roam this earth as he pleases, and he actually is about the working of seeking whom he may destroy through deception and his lies, and tearing down Christians and Christianity any way that he can. So with that thought in mind, people come to this Revelation 20 and they read these first 3 verses. I saw an angel come down from heaven holding in his hand a key to the bottomless pit and a great chain. He seized the dragon, the ancient serpent, who's the devil and Satan, and then bound him for 1,000 years. Well, that's what you do when you get a prisoner, right? You bind him. You put shackles on his arms. And then they threw him into a pit. Now, Where does that sound familiar? Remember, Daniel's in the lion's den, was in a pit. Um, Paul in Acts was thrown into a pit when he was arrested several times, and because they didn't build these, these storage places like we have jails today, they threw him into a pit and put a rock over it and sealed it up. And so what did they do? It says it threw him into a pit, shut it, and sealed it over him, so that he might not cleave the nations any longer until 1,000 years were ended. After that, he must be released for a little while. The implication there is that he is being bound inside of a prison. Whether he is specifically thrown into a pit is metaphorical, but in some way, just as the lake of fire is a real place in the other realm, Satan is being cast into a place that is real in the other realm, and he's being kept from deceiving the nations. So this is not a binding. Now, this happens when? When does this happen? See, in the narrative, you can't really tell from Revelation 20. It just says that it's happened. Well, what happened in the previous chapter is the second coming, where the armies of heaven destroy the armies of the beast. All that is done. So immediately they come into this next chapter, and it says that Satan is seized and thrown in so he can't deceive. Now, why is that important? And that's because it was Satan who deceived the people. And it was by deception of the signs and wonders that people followed the beast. So if Satan is stopped from being able to deceive the nations more, then his work is being cut off. He's not able to do that anymore. And that's what it's describing, that what Satan used to do is no longer happening. He has been cut off and put in that prison. So here we are in this next verse, and he switches over into a heavenly a vision. It says, "Then I saw thrones, seated on him where those who had the authority to judge was committed." Okay, so I saw the throne. Seated on them were people who had authority to judge. Previously we saw the 24 elders. And of course we know that's God, we know that's Jesus. And this also goes back to chapter 6. Now, I saw the souls of those who had been beheaded for the testimony of Jesus and for the word of God, and those who had not worshipped the beast or its image, and not received its mark on their foreheads or their hands. Now, let's point something else. And those who had not, well, who are those? Those are the souls. Those are the people that he stood before the throne. I saw the souls who had been beheaded, and those who had not worshipped the beast and had not received its mark on their foreheads. The people who had died, who had been killed, they're the ones who are standing before. Those are the souls of, and that's how a description of the souls that were beheaded, right? So I come to this next line. They came to life and reigned with Christ for 1,000 years. They, who is they? Again, in context, any basic grammar person would understand they is referring to somebody else that was previously mentioned. That's basic grammar. Okay, who were the people previously mentioned? The souls of those who had been beheaded for the testimony of Jesus. I had somebody argue, I'm not mentioning his name, so if you're ever, castrated on here, but they came to life and reigned. So who's they? The souls of those who had been beheaded. I can't find where they could be anybody else from any other passage from any other scripture, because he's a narrative dialogue that's going on. I saw the souls of people who had been beheaded. These are the people who didn't worship the beast, the image, or didn't take the mark. They came to life and reigned with Christ for 1,000 years. People, here's what we learn from this. First of all, beheaded people are physically dead people standing in heaven. Physically dead people. They came to life. What is coming back to life? Well, they were alive, they were killed, they're standing in heaven. In one sense, they're alive in heaven, we understand. But life is being described as what? Life on earth, as walking around in the human body and living. So Jesus came back to life. Lazarus came back to life. The people that Paul resurrected in Acts, they came back to life. Martha, when she talked about resurrection, I know that he will be raised up in the last day. So they came to life. So now we've got these people who were beheaded. They came to life And they're the ones who are going to reign with Christ for 1,000 years. So that indicates these people who are being raised to life are the ones going to be reigning with him. Now, the rest of the dead don't come back to life until the 1,000 years were ended. And he calls this the first resurrection. Okay? People who were dead, beheaded, they came to life. This is the first resurrection. Now, if I was to do a complete grammar breakdown of these things to show you, verbs, nouns, verses and nouns and things like that, preposition phrases and all of that, you would see how that structure works, because that's exactly the way the sentence structure should go. Is that I saw the souls of those beheaded, they came to life, action, and what else did they do? They reigned with Christ for 1,000 years. But then what? The rest of the dead, everybody else, did not come to life until the 1,000 years were ended. Now, the next question is these beheaded people, does that mean in this first resurrection only the people who were killed during the tribulation are raised in this first resurrection? See, in dispensationalism, they're saying that the first resurrection happens at the rapture, at the beginning of the 7 years tribulation. And that's why it's a severe problem, because it says you can't have a rapture of people being raised up in one resurrection, then another resurrection happen, and then a third resurrection happening. And I'll explain a little bit more why you can't have three, of course. But it says here, the first resurrection. Now, people also want to argue that this first resurrection is about people being saved. Well, I hate to say it. What does this refer to? Where does it go back to? Those who had not worshipped the beast, these people, they came to life. So if they came to life, this is the first resurrection. So the first resurrection has to happen after these people are beheaded and killed. Now, when we go back to 1 Thessalonians 4 and 1 Corinthians 15, what is the promise of his coming? What happens? Especially in 1 Thessalonians 4. He will bring with him those who have died, and those dead people will be first raised, and then we who are alive will be changed. So, at his coming, all of those people that are in heaven come with him, and they are the ones. This is the resurrection, the standing again of the dead. This is the first resurrection being talked about. This is not talking about the new life, or the first resurrection that we experience. Now, let me explain this also to you. What happens to a Christian when they are saved, it is called the doctrine of regeneration. Your spirit is died and recreated. It is remade in the new birth. And that's why he calls it a new birth. A new birth is when your spirit is made alive. You were this before, this dies, you come back as something completely different. Your spirit has been made and remade, born again. That is the language that it comes to and it used to. Now, when Paul came to his theology in Romans, he says, now, if you recognize that Christ died, was laid in a tomb, and came out 3 days later, the symbolism is in the action is in baptism. We died with him, we were buried with him, and we rose with him. We didn't actually do it. He did. He's the one who resurrected. We didn't resurrect. We were recreated and made new. He's using that as an analogy to describe the new birth. What happens to us? It is as if we died and we were buried and then we came back to life. Why is that not resurrection for us, the regeneration? Think about it. Jesus went into the ground. He came back to life. His body came back to life. Yes, it was changed, but it was his body that came back to life. Our spirit is not coming back to life. It is being killed, changed, remade, renewed, the whole, whatever you want to, terminology you want to use. But we are being born again. The spirit is being recreated in us. That is why it's called the new birth. It is not called resurrection. We can never call the new birth resurrection. We want the old man to die and stay buried. That old nature of ours that ruled over our lives, we want him to die and not come back changed. We want a new spirit. Create a new spirit within me. how many biblical passages do I have to need to bring up to bring that, to renew a right spirit, to make something new within me, and to make it new? So the old man dies, is what Paul says, and the spirit is raised. It's not resurrected. Um, Theology point 101. I hate to tell you that. So the rest of the dead did not come to life. Now, what does it mean until the 1,000 years were ended? So we have a start of the 1,000 years and an ending. The start of the 1,000 years is not a binding of Satan. It is not Satan being imprisoned. Do you get that, Amill? That's not what starts it. What starts it? They came to life and reigned with Christ for 1,000 years. Not 2,000 years, not 3,000 years, or anything else. Now, Revelation is the only book in the epistles in the New Testament that talks about 1,000 years. But it talks then, of course, later on about a new heavens and an earth. According to then Old Testament, where did we get the idea that there's this time of peace on earth? And if I was to go back, and I've got a paper written, but if I was to go back in the Old Testament, what would it say in Isaiah? It's about that, 1,000 years of peace when Jerusalem dwells in peace and there are no enemies, and that Christ, in Zechariah 12 and 14, Christ rules over all the nations. In fact, in 19, what does it say? He will rule the nations over with a rod of iron. He's brought all enemies under his feet. In a sense, all the nations are now under him. And Zechariah 14, he will rule on this earth over the entire nations. That is something that the Amill and the post-mill both deny, is that Christ rules on earth. I can get into a further discussion with that at another time. But the idea, of course, that blows that all up is Zechariah 14, I believe 14, where it says, and those who survive will come, of the nations that gathered against Israel, will come year after year to worship the King. Well, if everybody is completely killed in a post-mill scenario, there's nobody left on the earth because it's all burnt up, nobody's left alive, period, then Jerusalem isn't alive after his coming. And now Zechariah 12 and 14 are both second coming prophecies. So if he comes at the end of the post, all of it is destroyed. There's nobody that can come year after year to Jerusalem, because why? Of these other nations to worship the King, because they're all dead, they're all destroyed. And that's what somebody argued with me, is that they're all dead, they're all gone, there's nobody left on there. But Zechariah 14:14 says, of the people who survived of those nations will come year after year to Jerusalem. See, in the traditional premillenary system, the 1,000 years is what we believe that the Scripture teaches, that Christ, according to Acts 1, in fact, when the disciples asked him, Lord, at this time are you going to restore the kingdom to Israel? You promised that a son of David would sit on the throne of his father David. Well, yes, that's metaphorically in heaven. We understand that, and Jesus rules in heaven at this point. But Jesus even taught his disciples to pray what? On heaven as it is on earth, meaning as in heaven on earth, God is going to come down and rule and reestablish Israel. Now, what is my proof for that? Let me skip ahead just a quick. 1,000 years, the mark of the beast. The beast has all been thrown into the lake of fire. He's gone. Satan is thrown into the prison. He's there. All of that happens, okay? So when the 1,000 years, Satan is released from his prison. He is not unbound. He is released from his prison and will come out to deceive the nations that are at the four corners of the earth. Gog and Magog, to gather them for battle. Their number is like the sand of the sea. And they marched over the broad plain of the earth and surrounded the camp of the saints and the beloved city. Do you remember when Paul taught in 1 Thessalonians that we will ever be, after we are resurrected and raised, that we meet him in the air and we will ever be with the Lord? Revelations 19 talks about us being in front with the Lord and then coming back as his army. We're his army. That is the one that fights against the beast and his army in Revelations 19. I just thought came to my mind. Think about this too. Where else have we seen this in a very popular movie in the last few years that brings up this whole scenario? People, Helm's Deep. Not Helm's Deep, excuse me. Lord of the Rings, The Return of the King. Remember where Aragorn, Strider, Dunedain. He has to walk through the halls of dead, and when he comes back, he comes with that army of dead people. They come and they attack the bad army and kill him. That's exactly what he's depicting, is the dead saints coming back to life. Yeah, he changed it a little bit, I know, because that's the way, but the imagery is still there, that he brings back these dead, they fight, and it is the saints that are coming back with them. And he rules from Jerusalem, which is the beloved city, and from Jerusalem, um, on the broad plain of the earth, and surrounded the camp of the saints. That word camp is barracks, and its barracks is where an army is the one who camps out there. So what army is camped out there with it? I got to go back to it, I guess. Where does it say? And the armies of heaven, arrayed in fine linen, white and pure, were following them on white horses. The army. So what is the army are going to do? They're going to barracks there in Jerusalem. They're going to come back to Jerusalem and live. The city that he loves. Preterists want to argue that Jerusalem, if this is a recapitulation of 70 AD all the way up until now, or even back in that time, especially at full preterism, when, during that 40 years, would Jerusalem ever be called the beloved city or the camp of the saints? Because specifically the saints were told to flee Jerusalem, not to camp out there. They were told to flee. So it was not the camp of the saints in 70 AD, and it was not the beloved city. It was the one that was being crushed and destroyed for rejection of Christ. So the same thing goes into a future scenario. They are living there after the return of Christ. Christ comes, Satan bound. He's there. The resurrection had happened. Those guys that were raised are the ones who are ruling with Jesus from Jerusalem, the camp of the saints, and then they will reign with him for 1,000 years. And then Satan is released at the end of that 1,000 years. He gathers this army. They come, they surround Jerusalem, and that's when the fire comes down from heaven and consume them. Now this goes back to Peter. Peter doesn't include talking about the 1,000 years, does he? People say that Jesus comes and he burns up the earth. He doesn't include the 1,000 years. Why? It's not included there. You can't sit there and tell me that every time the scripture talks about second coming, they give you every detail about what's going to happen. Or when they talk about resurrection, they give you every detail what's happening. So why do people assume that 2 Peter is giving you every detail when he not once mentions the 1,000 years? The only place you find it, I said, here in Revelations. So the devil is cast down, right? Who has deceived them, was thrown into the lake of fire and sulfur. Where are the, when you look at the Greek there, where are the beast and the false prophet? It doesn't say were. It says where are the beast. The word are there, of course, has that past tense nuance to it, that the idea that the beast and the false prophet were there already. Okay, they were there. When were they put in there? Chapter 19, at his coming, Christ comes. Then what happens? Satan is bound. So Satan has to be bound. The resurrection has to happen. Then the 1,000 years, and then what? Satan is released at the end of this 1,000 years. That tells you there is a time frame. You can't tell me that the beast and the false prophet live for this thousands of years. Do you understand that? That blows the mind. What you're saying is that the beast and the false prophet are there at the beginning of the millennium. They are living all the way through. And then just at the end there is that when that 3.5 years happens, the beast and false prophet, that's when it all breaks out. And then they get caught when Christ comes back. They get thrown in there. And then Satan is getting thrown in here. Well, do you see how that scenario does not work? It says they were thrown in first, the beast and the false prophet. Satan was not thrown into the lake of fire at the same time. He was put in prison first. Then he was released. Then he was captured again and thrown into the lake of fire. There's a difference between throwing into a pit and into the lake of fire. Okay? So how do I come up with the premillenialism? Well, I'm talking about, of course, that Christ comes at the end of the tribulation period. The rapture happens. the first resurrection of all the saints, all the just in Christ who have died previously, they are all resurrected. They come to life. That's the first resurrection. They, the ones who were deceived, were not deceived, excuse me, and killed and all that. They represent that group. See, it implies here that only those people were the ones who were raised, and they're the ones that are coming to life. But the idea is that we got to harmonize. First Thessalonians 4, 1 Corinthians 15. At his coming, there's a resurrection of all the saints. At his coming, there's a resurrection of all the saints. This is the first resurrection of the just. The second resurrection is of the unjust. The rest of the dead, the unjust, did not come to life until the 1,000 years were ended. That was the first resurrection of them. This is the second. This would be the second. So why are the second ones being resurrected in body? I saw the great and dead standing before the throne, and the books were open. Daniel 7, 13, or 10, 11, isn't it? Then another book was opened, which is the book of life. And the dead were judged by what was written in the books. In other words, all those dead people that were raised, according to what they had done, not will do. So again, that refutes full preterism that the judgment happens of us before we're even born. It's appointed for men to live once and then face judgment. Great white judgment is at the end, when they're of all men who have ever lived will be standing before him. Because what? The sea gave up the dead. Well, what is in the sea? Spirits? You think really spirits are floating around in the sea? Or do you think it's the bodies of the dead people who were died that gave up the dead? Those were in it. Death, then, is the grave. It's being talked about the body that is in the ground. That is death. So all the tombs, all the bodies in the tombs, they come out, and what's in Hades? The spirits of the people. So the body and the spirit gave up the dead. Both of them. Do you see that contrast? They're talking about the dead body, the spirit. Both of them come back. There's that resurrection that happens to the unjust, and they were judged, each one of them, according to what they've done. So death and Hades were thrown into the lake of fire. It ends. There is no need for a grave anymore, because nobody is going to die from that point forward. That is when the last enemy, death, is defeated. Right there in verse 14. Because everybody who has ever lived is standing before the throne. There will never ever be another person born or living after that point of the great white judgment. Otherwise, they would be living their lives, and they too would have to face judgment. Then this would not be the great white throne judgment. He would have to have another judgment for those people who lived afterwards. But since there is no giving birth in the resurrection, there is no more children being born, there is no more life going on in that sense of people growing up and dying and all of those things. It's done. It's over with. So here's the resurrection. So if anybody's name was not found written in the book of life, he was thrown into the lake of fire, where he will, what? Be tormented day and night forever and ever and ever and ever, time without end. So that's basically it in a nutshell. Second coming, the tribulation period with the beast. Second coming, resurrection, rapture happens. 1,000 years happens. After the end of 1,000 years, Satan is released and deceives the nations again. Populations and all that have grown up. Okay, he is cut down by fire. Everybody on the earth, that's it. That's the end of everything. And immediately we're taken all up into heaven to be judged for what we did while we were in the body. The bad people go to the lake of fire. The good people enter into the new heaven and earth, which is a remade heaven and earth. And the new Jerusalem, the city where God will dwell with his people, comes out of heaven. Heaven is not our final destination, folks. Earth is a remade one. So that's it in a nutshell. I can't explain it any better any other way. Probably taking up too much time now as it is and what I've done here. So thanks again for listening. If you have any questions, hey, you can find me on Facebook real easy, Stephen Whitsitt. You guys have a good night. We'll talk to you later.